But unit testing is the soul of the earth. Yeah.
I like
If
that.
you're not
I like
friends
that.
with Mr. Unit, I think your life is going to be very miserable.
Yeah, yeah. You know how the haters of testing, right, will say, "Oh, look at all those losers testing their code and using code coverage as a measure. Oh, code coverage is such a useless measure. Why even write tests?" Yes, engineering of awesome. Welcome everyone.
Do you think we should maybe wait for somebody to say we're awesome? Or
No, I think just take it, claim it. Yeah.
all right, stamp of approval. We
Fake
are
it till you make
awesome,
it.
and this is engineering of awesome.
Engineering of awesome. And we want everyone else to be awesome. That's why we're doing this, yeah?
We all awesome.
We're all awesome. Some more awesome than others.
Uh,
Off to
I'm not even 5 minutes into it, and we're already
a
labeling and
cracking start.
classifying,
A
rating,
cracking start.
cracking start, rating.
For those that haven't met us yet, I'm Dan, and I wear many hats. One is the CTO of homes.com.au. I'm also running a coaching business for software engineers who want to level up their career called Velocifier. You can get that at velocifier.com. What about you, Fred?
Well, I don't wear hats. I wear caps, and many of them, but not at the same time. I'm a principal engineer, and I am also a mentor. And I am eager to experience some awesomeness with you today, Dan. I'm looking
Excellent.
forward to what we're going to be talking about today.
Excellent. Well, today we're going to be talking about automated tests.
Automated test. Two of my favorite words: automated
Ooh,
and
I
test.
I thought this was going to be a good spicy episode for you, Fred. I thought you'd like this one.
It's spicy, it's nice, it's automated test.
So I first of all wanted to know, because I don't know that we've actually discussed this before between ourselves in the past. What, over time, were you always, let's say you were born and you were born a software engineer, I'm sure, coding since you were 6 months old. Were you always into automated tests?
Nah, wasn't even into test.
No?
No,
No testing?
no.
So what I'm interested to know, like how has your views on automated testing changed over time?
Dramatically. It was always testing, a form of manual testing, because we needed to make sure that things are working. But we're not with the focus of reducing the amount of effort and investment that's got to be every time you make a change. But I think testing goes closely with architecture and the type of implementation. So if it's not well structured, you're going to find it very hard to test. And sometimes when you start out, there's no structure. And with that no structure, there's no test. So you have your friend, Mr. Manual, to help you out.
The old Mr. Manual.
Mr. Manual.
Mr. Manual. How
Mr.
early
Manual
do
is
you think you
awesome.
can Mr. Manual of awesome. How do you think you can get into automation then? Like can we avoid the Mr. Manual altogether? Why can't we avoid Mr. Manual?
I think you can avoid it. But I think it's that old saying, if you're going to do it twice, automate it. I think that's probably the starting point. So if you envision that this is going, well, there's a few things that goes with that. One is compliance and regulations and requirements and standards, and that would define how you will be implementing your test. But if you're working in an organization, you're probably going to be writing automated tests from day one. because you're not working in a small, isolated startup, where you just you want to verify something. But yeah, you could start up with writing tests from day one. But now the question is, what are those automated tests you will be writing? What are they, Dan?
What are they? Yes, yes. That's a very good question, actually, because I have this discussion sometimes with software developers, if particularly in interview situations. I think because you see a bunch of different personalities, experiences, all in a kind of condensed time period, and I think in those, I seem to have the discussions with people. I guess the topic of automated testing comes up in interviews, and I hear different things because there are some software developers who would say like unit tests, for example. Unit tests are no good because they break all the time when you need to refactor things, and they're too low level, and you spend a lot of time writing tests at that level for not much value. And I don't know. It's an interesting. I can see some of the logic in that. Yes, I think there is value of testing, say, more of a black box integration style testing where if something breaks that, say, another service is relying on contractually. And also, if you are wanting to refactor or you're anticipating that, having unit tests not get in the way of that, I could see some benefit to that. But what you said was interesting, though, about, I'm assuming you're referring to when you're talking about compliance, say, or you have a certain rule set that you need to make sure does what it's supposed to do. I'm assuming you're talking about unit level testing for that kind of thing. Would you be?
It can be a combination. But unit testing is the soul of the earth. Yeah.
I like
If
that.
you're not
I like
friends
that.
with Mr. Unit, I think your life is going to be very miserable.
Yeah, yeah.
If you,
So that's like a foundational thing you're saying.
yeah, you drive down the road of integration and end to end, can be a flaky experience.
That is true.
Yeah.
Yes.
But I mean,
That's
you 100% correct when it comes to too granular implementation of your tests, causing to refactoring headaches and causing to maintaining. So making a small change and suddenly everything breaks. But then I think it all comes down to understanding the business requirement and testing the business requirement instead of testing the code implementation itself. So if you understand what you need to test, it becomes a bit easier. And if you're using maybe test-driven development, that could change a few things.
yeah, test-driven development. That can be a controversial subject.
Well, I think the controversial subject is the fact that we still have to talk about testing. Yeah, we're still talking in interviews about testing. We still
Yeah,
have to have a conversation about somebody who is eager to try something new or become part of an organization, and they still having challenge about accepting testing or even understanding how we select them, the testing strategy that we'll be using. We're still at
yeah,
that phase after how many years?
yeah. It's kind of weird, isn't it? I wonder if we should blame all those internet blog articles and tutorials and books that just give you code with no tests.
I'm luckily enough, I haven't written a book with
Oh,
any code.
no.
So I'm relieved that I can say, yes, maybe we should. you know,
Maybe someone else should write that style of book so that we can all
yeah,
benefit. Or maybe you should write that book, Fred.
I I will start now. I will use my my new best friend, Mr. A and Mr. I. And I'm sure we'll have something ready by the end of the week.
Very good. Well, even with AI, you have to ask it to write you tests. So it doesn't give you tests by default either.
But the fact
If
that
you,
it can help you, I think that is the amazing part.
yeah,
I mean, using Copilot, GitHub Copilot, I've asked to experiment with recommendations to get a sense of what the code would look like. Because I mean, that's why you have an assistant, to help with producing something. It's the whole thing about it's the hardest part is to start. So have something and then tweaking it and playing with it becomes easier. But all of this is almost meaningless if you don't understand what you're trying to solve. Because you only know what to test if you understand what you're implementing and what's the business requirement.
yes, yes. I think isn't that the classic argument against TDD? That if you don't know what you're going to code, how can you write your test first?
But you do know what you're going to code. Because you're starting off with, it's like saying I'm building a house.
Mm.
And you're writing a first line as I'm going to lay down a few bricks. And then you're
Yep.
verifying that you've laid down a few bricks. The good thing about it is that you're reducing that waste. Because if you don't start off with writing a test and you're doing it as an afterthought, it becomes a lazy experience where you're ticking a box. You're
Yeah.
writing tests because somebody said to you along the way, you can't commit this code
Mm.
and can't go to production because you need to write tests. And then you just start thinking about, I've just done all this implementation and this API, so I probably need one or two tests in this space, and you just write stuff. And at the beginning, it probably looks okay. You have a few beautiful tests with an act and the shirt and all these beautiful little comments, and everybody loves you, and you got mocking here and mocking there, everybody's cheering you on. And then as time goes by and, we're getting to the end of the party and you look at the house and you realize, oh dear, I've got to do some cleanup. I have no idea what's going on here. So then it starts falling apart.
Mm.
Good
Yeah.
citizens, that's what we need to be, good citizens.
Yeah. 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 I actually had some code recently that actually had tests, but there were a lot of bugs, and unfortunately, the tests and the code maybe they tested part of it, but they didn't test maybe some other parts. And unfortunately, the parts that it wasn't testing. Actually, this is an interesting example. I wonder what you think of this, because when you have something that's more reliant on the database. So this example, actually, the role of the code was to organize some calculations, statistical calculations. And I think at the beginning, when the code was first started, it was easier and faster to actually have the database run the statistical result for you, or the process for you, right? So it wasn't done in code; it was done in SQL. What do you think are effective testing strategies if that's your? Can we still have nice tests if we are relying on the database?
So there's business logic in the database and like the SQL, like stored procedures of SQL, or
But yeah, this example wasn't quite stored procedure level, but it was. Let's say you have a whole bunch of records in the database. Let's say you have a whole bunch of prices, right? Some numbers, and you want to get. Let's say the simplest example is you have a whole bunch of numbers. Say there's like 5,000 numbers, and you want to get the median of that number across all those records. Pulling all those values into code, and I mean this is a scale of 1,000 is not huge, but there are some data sets that are quite a bit larger than that. So actually the biggest data set is about 2.5 million records. So your largest data set where you need the median is 2.5 million records. Your kind of smallish ones are around 1,000. So do you pull 2.5 million numbers into your application and then into an array and then calculate medians, or do you do it in the database? Obviously, in the application side, you can test that quite easily. What do you think about the database side of that?
Is this a trick question? You've got some betting on the side.
This is actually a real life example, and it's interesting because when the code first started, it was relatively fast, and it did its calculations in the database. Now, though, that the problem that's being solved has gotten a bit more complex, it's actually slow anyway. And in the past, actually, I wrote some code that was similar to this, probably 2 years ago, almost 3 years ago, in the same area, the same data set. And what I ended up doing at that time is I did pull all of the data into memory. So I did a query and pulled all the data and put it into memory. The penalty for that was speed, so it was fairly slow. And it also forced me to allocate additional memory in production. So using it locally and testing was fine, but when the code actually went to production on a production data set, I had to increase probably like offer, originally in the first version, most of these services were running the kind of fairly small memory footprint. I had to, I think, like quadruple it or something to actually get enough memory to pull the data into memory so I could do the calculations. So at the time, that was the old version that was running fairly slow, took lots of memory, but was well tested. Then previously down the track, a different engineer has gone in and done some things in the database, which is less well tested, but runs quite fast because the database can do those calculations pretty quick and without additional memory. So pretty efficient. But the downside is, I guess, at a certain level of complexity, I'm actually seeing as the code has progressed following the path of, yes, you can get the database to do this work for you. Following that path, as the rules got more complex, so it wasn't just a median anymore. It was kind of like, we need a median, then we need to compare it to this value, take a percentage of two different values or its percentage change over time. Then we're also ranking every single number, every single result gets ranked in a percentile. So there's like, I don't know, maybe 5 operations now with additional business logic to restrict some of the values or massage some of the values. So it's getting complicated. And when it got complicated, think this has started as, I'm going to let the database do all the work, right? So database does all the work. It's getting more complicated. More of these operations are happening. Then it ends up being that, there's actually like at least 3 bugs that I can see if I look through the data and the result, just manually, Mr. Manual, pulling out Mr. Manual's test. If I look through that data, I can see there's probably about 3 bugs in here where the calculations don't look correct. And based on the basic rule sets that I was talking about, right? So I can see that there's bugs in the code. But now when I go and look at the code, it's, offloaded everything to the database. So I don't actually have a group of tests that verify the calculations and the data and tells me that these SQL statements do what they're supposed to do. And if I think in that, there's a couple of options probably available. I'd be interested to hear what you think. How do you think you would go about testing that?
So there's a few things that you mentioned there that's popping out for me, and it feels like we're testing a few things. So one is the performance of the calculation, but then there's also the calculation itself, and how are you determining the median, the value, the outcome you're looking for, and if I understand it correctly, there's an aspect of that where a subset of that data could be leveraged. So you want to verify that whatever algorithm or formula you're using is working without putting too much data towards it. But then you also want to be in a position that if you start scaling up with the number of data towards that you can actually verify that it's performing an experience. If this is for a user front end, that the experience for the user is still going to be good enough. So it's different things we want to verify. But for me, rule is not to put stuff in the database. One, it makes it extremely difficult. One, you don't know where it is. I think they putting business requirements in a database. No. Let's move it to somewhere where we can test it in a different fashion. I don't know if I think about SQL brought in all these goodies with functions and SQL store procedures and the ability to have triggers and all this stuff when you have your data. So there's all these value in doing it. But the experience over the years is that it just creates so many challenges, especially even when we start thinking about the architectures, the newer architectures that comes into play. And if you want to transition, if you want to scale, or if you want to just do some form of refactoring or pulling something out, it becomes extremely difficult. So I still think separating the calculation and then looking at mechanisms that you can actually cater and handle the data better.
It's interesting, right? Like you can be quite performant by offloading some things to the database, but you get hit with quite a big downside that you can't test it. For example, like it's very hard to automated test that. I wonder if business logic in the database is interesting. That takes me back like 20 years. I wonder if that was created so that you didn't have to, back in the old days, you didn't have to write change requests and have it tested and stuff like that. You could just modify it. If you got access to the database, you just modify it in the database and everyone's happy.
Sometimes wonder if it's just for the audience, so that separation, you at your DBA or your person that's very close to doing some analysis and analytical data. So having that mechanism available, so it's living in that space. But then again, it could also be about just a selling point. How do you sell a database? So you give it, like everything in life, you give it a few goodies, although down the track, that it's probably not going to be the best thing.
There are some databases that have an exceptionally high, unbelievable amount of functionality in a database. It's like its own operating system in there. So it's out of control, some of those. So I'm wondering, Fred, in your career, has there been something that has an event or some kind of experience or a group of experiences that sticks in your mind that has taught you the value of automated testing? War story?
There's one story.
Yeah. Do tell.
It's not a scary story. It felt a bit scary at the stage. So a dear friend of mine that we both acquainted of ours, a good friend.
Yep.
We worked together in an organization, and we had we all worked together at one point, and this is related to that.
If
scenario.
This is a bad thing, this got nothing to do with me.
There's always something to do with you. Well, I mean, we can always blame Dan for everything.
Well, you can. That's fine.
But and this is probably one of the things that we're probably going to be talking about testing is the scenario of the implications of pressure, deadlines, stuff needs to get out, deadlines, impact on customers, because that's why we do stuff. We want to provide value. And coming into a new space with a very complex systems, code, understanding some legacy implementation with areas with limited test. And we had to make a lot of changes to be compliant. And in that period, picked up one little story along the way, made a few changes, got some code ready, wanted to push it to our friend to GitHub.
Yep.
And I got called over to our friend's station.
You got the call over.
Yeah, said, hey, friend, come over
Was
to
that
my
in
station.
response to a pull request? Was it?
Yeah, it's like, hey, I got your PR in front of me, and I said, yeah, good, yeah, get it. Just
that could sometimes be better than just like firing off a whole bunch of insults in the PR comments. So that's very graceful of this person, to come and talk to you in person.
I said, saw your code and just wondering where's your test? Yeah, I said, yep, there's no test. It's it's complicated piece of work. We need to get it out. To implement tests will mean a lot of refactoring, so can't write tests. I says, okay, but we need tests. I said, yeah, I know we need tests. Absolutely, totally agree. Test, yes, I want to write tests. I want to click test, but under the situations, pressure. Remember, I said pressure, deadline. Can't write tests. Yeah, I understand what you're saying, and I agree. It's code's hard, but we need tests. And that was a game changer for me.
Yeah.
Because I could see the value in doing it. And I drank the Kool-Aid, become the ambassador for testing after that. And it really, before that, I've heard about tests and understood about unit tests and the different approaches, and really found a lot of the challenges with different kind of approaches and even the type of languages or implementations that we used over a period of time, which made it quite challenging to implement tests. And there was always that underlying urge and desire to write beautiful tests because I know we should be doing it. That was the change of all changes. And after that, it was just test. Yeah.
You're on board.
Yes, I have to thank him for pointing it out in a very beautiful way. It's like playing a bass guitar.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I love bass guitar. It's good.
He loves a bass guitar.
So we'll come back around to the question about time. Definitely. I want to share my war story because it's fun. Well, not fun at the time, but in hindsight. So I remember in my first few years in writing code, I didn't write any tests, and I just went with it. Just went with it. And I even started using a framework that had tests built in, but I still didn't write tests. I just pumped out that code as fast as I could. And one day it was on a Thursday night, and I was making some changes to some code, and I had a plan. I'd committed to one of my customers that I would ship this new version by the end of the week. I was flying to Sydney, though, the next morning. And so Thursday night, I'm sitting there coding away happily with no test, and I ship my code. And I deployed, this was back in the day before cloud. So my customer had a server on premise, and I logged into the server. I deployed the new version, and it was done. Everyone was happy. I went to bed. In the morning, I got up for my flight to Sydney. And when I was getting ready, I thought, should I take my laptop? And I thought about it for, good 30 seconds. I thought, no. I wasn't going to Sydney for work. I was going for a conference for something else. And I thought, no, I don't need my laptop. I'll just leave it here. So left it, flew to Sydney. I landed, and at about 8:15 in the morning, I got a phone call from my customer. And they said, most of the system is broken. I can't. Part of it was working. Part of it was not. They could navigate to parts of the system and just nothing would work. They were getting some strange error. And I was filled with dread immediately because I had no laptop. And so I'm thinking on the fly, thinking, how on earth am I going to fix this? I'm in a different state, very far away from my computer, and I don't have it with me. So I said to the customer, I will figure something out and get back to you. So while I was brainstorming ideas, I thought, you know what, this was back in the day, actually, before the iPhone existed. But I did have a smartphone, luckily. So it was right in the time spot where I didn't need a laptop. I had a smartphone. I thought, great. Now, I'd never done anything like this on my smartphone before, but I quickly kind of searched around. I can't even remember. I think there was a web browser on the phone. So I searched around for an SSH client that I could install, a terminal client that I can install on my phone. I found one, and I realized that what I could do was log in to my server, because I did, even though there was no cloud, I did have a VPS server, luckily. So that was actually the server that I was using had a copy of all my Git repositories. So I would push, back in the day before GitHub was a thing, I pushed a remote headless version of the Git repository. So you couldn't actually see the code, but all the Git data files and stuff were stored on the server. So luckily, I could log into the server. I had to install Git because not even Git was on the server. So I installed that, cloned the repository, made the change, fixed the code, and then committed a new version. And then unfortunately, I had to run the customer over the phone on how to do a deployment. So I had to get them to SSH into the server and then run a command to check out, deploy a new version out of the Git repository. So that was a bit hectic, but it worked and crisis averted. But from that day onwards, I thought, this is now the time. This is now the time when I need to write tests, because I didn't want to be in that situation again. And so ever since that day, but pretty much, I had a fairly sizable code base back then, and I had to retrospectively add tests to my whole system. I think I don't recall exactly how long it took me. I did it in like stages, and I certainly probably started with kind of more end-to-end type tests, I'm pretty sure. But I kind of built up the suite of tests around that code over time. But yeah, that was an experience I did not want to repeat again. So I learned my lesson the hard way.
How much of the conference did you miss?
Actually, it wasn't too bad. It was funny. The fix was like so minuscule. It was like one character that shouldn't have been there, or a misnamed variable or something like that. It was like super quick to fix. So I don't think I actually missed anything of the conference, actually, because by the time when they called me, so he luckily my customer got into the office. He started quite early. So by 8 a.m., he had already gotten to the computer to kind of, start his kind of work process for the day, found the bug within like 10 minutes and then called me. So luckily it happened right at the beginning of the day and the fix was very fast. So I dodged a bullet with that one.
Lucky Dan.
Lucky Dan.
If only you wrote some tests.
If only I'd written some tests. Yeah. That's right. But I learned my lesson. So there's this old chestnut of you know how the haters of testing, right, will say, "Oh, look at all those Look at all those losers testing their code and using code coverage as a measure. Code coverage is such a useless measure. Why even write tests? Who needs tests when code coverage just gives you such a an inaccurate view of how your tests are actually going? What would you say to them, Fred? What would you say to the haters?
Like, I can't repeat what I would say to them, on this recording, because it's
Family friendly, yeah.
Yeah, this is a family friendly environment. Are we talking about code coverage? Are we talking about tests? Are we talking about both?
Well, I think it's okay. This really comes down to the point. The point I think of what I wanted to talk about was I find it quite an interesting topic around how do you know, particularly probably in your position and my position, because we are not day to day sitting next to an engineer or sitting within a team of engineers day to day working side by side, right? So let's say you and I would like to have a certain amount of tests being done, or we would like a certain level of quality to be there, a certain level of testing to be there. We want engineers day to day to kind of know how to navigate through that question mark, right? How much testing should I be doing? Should I be writing? And I'm interested to know, because some people will go, "Oh, we just slap code coverage in there as a metric, and everyone's happy." Some will say that's ridiculous, but I'm kind of really interested in, firstly, like, how do you measure? Can you measure it? What an acceptable level of testing is, and then if you're a leader where you're not side by side in the trenches with other engineers, how do you set, if you can't measure it, how do you help people navigate, the questions day to day of, should I write tests for this, or what kind of testing strategy should I use, or how should I write my code in a certain way? What do you think?
It's an interesting one, because code coverage does help you with that. So it's a form of an indicator, but it's not the rule book. But it also, it's like having a dipstick, and you can see there's oil in the car, but it doesn't give an indication that the car's healthy. There's other factors, but it does give you some form of a metric and a measurement. But if you put it all together and you think about why we're running the test, is we want to verify that what we've implemented is going to behave in a certain way. And if you don't have the test, and that new implementation is heavily being used by the customer, the metric that's going to help us in that space is the number of bugs or the number of failures that we can measure. So we're actually going to get first-hand information from our customer via our support channels and saying, hey, I'm trying to do X calculation, I clicked on this button, nothing's happening. And based on that feedback that we're getting, and that's where monitoring and that observability and logs, and there's even other forms of testing that we can use in that space that will help us to get an indication. But I think code coverage is an indicator for us, just to highlight that based on what you've implemented, you basically have an average that's coming through. So you can see how much of the code is actually being covered by the test you're doing. But I'm not a believer in it's got to be 100% or it's got to be 90% code coverage. I don't think that really. And especially if you're looking at a code base that is either legacy, something that's previously implemented with very little coverage, and then suddenly you're looking at code coverage, that's not going to give you any representation. And it's also not going to help you with a strategy to improve your quality and your testing in that space, because from a monetary value and investment, you're going to be chucking a lot of money for engineers running tests in spaces that's maybe never actually being used or never adding value. So if you're looking from a customer perspective and saying, this area of the implementation is heavily used, that's the area I would be focusing. So if you look at the implementation you're doing, and you can actually get an indication of these are the core critical things that needs to be tested. So if I'm going to be choosing where I'm going to be focusing, that's the stuff I'll be doing. I'm not just going to spread out and going, well, I've got 100% code coverage. One, it doesn't give you an indication of the quality of the test. What is it actually? You're just writing something. It's just touching something.
Yeah. That's a good point, I guess. Like, other measures maybe are important. Support tickets, bugs. That's good. That's good. I wonder. I kind of think maybe it's useful for software developers to hold a level of skepticism for code coverage. As in, because I know, like, if you start up a test suite and you go, I'm going to run my tests, and if you do treat your tests as a black box, so let's say, okay, I'm just going to run an integration level test into like a pretty high level test, right? And you call something, go do this thing, and that may do a whole bunch of code execution, right? And then it will come back and say, oh, you've got coverage for days because I just executed like half of your code, and it's looking great. I think so, like there's been occasion. I remember back, I did work in a team with our mutual friend. Actually, at that time, we actually did have an expectation of 100% code coverage in that team. And what was interesting sometimes is, if you are not careful, sometimes you can run I think I was working on something where I'd added a bunch of code, and I was then just going through the code in pieces bit by bit to make sure I'd kind of written tests for every part, because I'd written a whole bunch of tests, but I was just going through the rest of the code, basically just double checking everything. And I noticed that if I had written it, I did write a high level test actually, and my code coverage immediately went to 100%. I was like, oh, sweet, done. but it wasn't real. In that scenario, it was executing code at the high level, but the test actually wasn't doing anything. It was just running the code, basically. So in that scenario, it was probably easy for me to pick it up. But I can imagine, it could be a little bit tricky sometimes to maybe a healthy level of skepticism is probably good to hold. Where if your reporting tool, coverage tool says, yeah, you're fine, everything's green. It might just be useful to hold in the back of your mind that it may not be real. So maybe it's just good to know down to the level of, in particular, like which parts of the code are actually being covered, instead of your tool just giving you maybe the 100% mark might be the skepticism point or something like that.
But I mean, so especially if you're talking about that black box approach and you're doing a high level test, you're implementing something that's going to cover quite a bit of your implementation. You can open yourself up for the situations where 80% of the time the value you're expecting is coming back, and then 20% of the time something crazy is happening, and there's one little function or calculation that's hidden in a class somewhere that is extremely important. The Jira ticket shouting at you, write a unit test. We need a unit test. Write a unit test.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. That's actually a very good point. And I've been caught out before. I've been caught out with some weird and wonderful test behavior sometimes. One in particular that sticks out to me was I'd run my test suite on most days of the year, no problemo, right? And then there were some weird times when the test failed. And it took me a while actually to work out what was wrong with it. Sometimes it would fail. I'd be like, it's failed. And then I'd come back the next day and it would pass. I'm like, that's weird. And it turned out, and then I found that actually the reason why I found out was because, so I had built a whole bunch of calendaring functionality. I built a whole feature around a calendar. It had like a appointments, reminders, all this kind of stuff, and you could visually see your calendar and all these things. And what I'd realized was that I think it was one day I came in, might have been like the 1st of January or something. I went and, ran the test, made some code. I was working that day, and heaps of my tests failed. I was like, what's going on? I definitely didn't change anything to make all those tests fail. Like, what's going on? And found that because of time zones and date shifts, the calendaring tests were actually, there were bugs that were picked up once I'd fixed the test, because they were masked by time zone shifts, and because I had users that were in different time zones, and all the tests kind of set up these users. Oh, this is user A, and they're in time zone A, and they're in time zone B, and you make sure that all of your reminders are firing at the right time, and everything's scheduled correctly. And I realized that based on the time on my machine, there was some inconsistent behavior where those tests were kind of sometimes passing, sometimes failing. But I didn't pick it up straight away, because in 99% of the time it was fine. It was only like in those small edge cases, where, so some of it can be, pretty tricky, but it's quite interesting that I don't think any of those reasons are justifiable reasons to say, well, testing is useless, right? Those tests, sure, I guess you're still writing code for these tests, right? So you still have to be mindful, I guess, of the quality you're using and the methodologies you're using to make sure that what you're testing is actually accurate and reliable and all those things, and take into those weird cases like time zones, all those kind of fun stuff. But yeah, it's kind of fascinating. It's quite easy sometimes, I think, to write a test and have this false confidence and go, yep, everything's fine. It's tested and working, but sometimes maybe not.
So if you want to convince somebody to write test, say, would you get on a plane? When you get to the door of the plane, and like you're going to hand over your ticket, and they say to you, welcome, just to let you know that the planes we use are not tested at all. We have no practices. We adhere to no engineering standards. We're quite confident that it will fly. We've had one or two issues along the way, but we've got some really good engineers working on this, and they're very confident that once we're up there in the air, nothing will go wrong.
Yeah, it would. Actually, one time I sat next to a pilot flying an international flight, and he told me some stories of things that happen on the flight with their computer systems, and it does make you feel a little bit uneasy. Once I told him I was in tech, he was like, "Oh, the tech we're using like 386s from like 1985 or something," and he said, "Oh, and they crash all the time." You're on a flight and the computer crashes. I just reboot it. I was like, really? That's really great to know. But yes, no, I think I've worked in, and I know you've worked in this kind of environments as well, but I have worked in a place once, years and many, many, many years ago, where it was people's finances involved, and the amount of support tickets we had for bugs around people's money was scary. And quality was not top of mind, I don't think, for a lot of people in that organization. This was before you and I knew each other, so it's not in any recent history. But yeah, it's kind of scary.
But I think there's a responsibility in all parties. So as engineers or developers, we have a responsibility to it. Sometimes wonder if it's similar to being a doctor, or where you take an oath, and you have to adhere to certain requirements and standards and the way you're going to be treating your patients. And I sometimes feel like there should be something similar for us in engineering, where you take an oath to, the code you're implementing is not for the sake of your own pleasure, and just for the sake of writing code, and that you ensure that whatever you do is with good intentions, and you're going to write tests, not because you just have to write tests, but to understand why we're doing it. But then also for business to acknowledge and understand that by pushing teams into a corner of delivering unrealistic expectations and reducing their ability to write and invest in maintaining and making sound decisions, that we are contributing to what you mentioned earlier, where we're all on an island and we see a little boat coming towards us and then it starts sinking. And then a little flag comes on and said, we should have written test.
Well, let's talk about that topic more, Fred. I think I hear it's a pretty common phrase in some corners of the software development community that engineers feel like they don't have time to write tests. What do you say to that?
I think there's probably some truth to it, because there's a lot of expectation. There's a lot of stuff that needs to happen. But then there's a part of me that feels that we created the excuse of the century to say we don't have time because we don't want to write tests. But I think it's a complicated scenario to play out, because on the one hand, I think it is that there's so many distractions and other stuff that we doing the whole day. I think context switching is probably contributing to that. So the ways of working and number of meetings, all of these factors, I think those play a part in how much time you want to invest in it. But I think there's a part of it these days, I think, is a discipline. Because why is it that there's some engineers that would be in a position to write tests, write good code, reading up on new tech, investing in their careers, all of these factors, and then you have another group that's going towards I don't have time to write tests, but I have time to fiddle with a PlayStation or, sitting
Playing
in the kitchen.
table tennis.
Yeah.
My thought is on this topic is that you're still testing, but you're Mr. Manual, because I don't think anyone is going to write code and ship it straight. No one. I don't think it's going to be doing that, no matter how much time you have or feel you have, lack of time you have. You're still testing, but it's manual. So I kind of see it as, well, if you took that time that you would spend manually testing, invested in automated testing, surely that's a better outcome. And sometimes if I'm writing code fast or experimental type code, or, I haven't really got my thoughts together yet, I'm just kind of trying different things out, it's kind of exploratory. When I'm doing that, there's actually a point. I did it probably maybe 6 months ago. I was working on something and I was just kind of coding in some different exploratory ways. And I got to the point where actually I realized that, I'm about to go and manually test this, because for the time leading up to that point, I was just kind of trying ideas. Like, it wasn't serious code. I was just kind of trying to figure out how I was going to express the solution to this problem. Then I got to the point where I was actually going to run it and test it. And I thought, okay, I'm at this point now. Now is actually the time to not even do a single manual test, not even start, but just realize that I was about to, and go, cool. Now I'm going to actually go back. I'm going to restructure the code, refactor it, test it, write unit tests, all that kind of stuff, right? But it's kind of interesting. I guess you could just quite easily just keep on that flow. You start exploratory, you move into manual testing, and you just kind of keep that cycle going. But I think if you're able to stop yourself and go, well, hang on a sec, manual testing is no good. Let's automate it and do it early and take that time you would put to manual test. 'Cause I think that problem with the manual test is an automated test, is going to run and repeat itself and run and repeat itself. And that's what you're doing. If you don't have your automated test, you're the guy that's like, you're repeating yourself over and over again, testing on all these different changes to make sure. And I'm sure that, like, when you're, I know a pretty common workflow is, right, you have your code editor on your screen and you're writing code, and then you're flipping, particularly if you're doing web development, then you're flipping into your browser and clicking stuff. It's like, well, okay, there's your smell, maybe, right? Like, maybe there's a case to be had to reinvest that time.
If you woke somebody up in the morning and said, can you go and test the following quickly? And then tomorrow morning you wake them up again and say, sorry, can you test this? And we actually have another 5 things. And then the next day, can you sorry, I was going to wake you up again. Actually, there's now 20 new things. So can you start at this point? I'm sure at some point they'll go, okay.
That actually happens though, right? Like, even when you're done, DONE done, you're not always done, because there's other people that are going to be looking at your code and giving it a go and testing, and even, say, user acceptance, right? Like, somebody is probably most likely going to take your code and verify that it does what it's supposed to do. And if there's a problem and it comes back, then you got to retest it all over again. I think it's interesting that I was having a conversation with the product side of the business the other day, and we were talking about, when we were actually talking about the topic of user acceptance testing, and they were kind of asking the question, oh, can I just test this in isolation? Can I just take one little bit and test it? But the reality is, and this is the difficulty with the manual testing side, right? It's pretty common that you can change one small thing and it affects something somewhere else. That's pretty common. And so I said to them, I was like, look, it's probably better in this context. It's better to probably wait until you have, not just one little part, but you have all the parts, and then you can do user acceptance testing on all of the parts. Because if you just test one and then call it good, there's a decent chance that in continuing with these other bits that, it's going to come back and affect something. So.
But you could write front-end test.
Yeah. What do you think of that, actually? So in homes.com.au, which is an early stage startup, we don't have front-end tests, automated end-to-end type testing. We've probably had it, I think we had it a little bit in some small forms, but it's probably the classic thing of, it was misbehaving, so someone switched it off. What's your philosophy on that level of testing?
I mean, if I think about using TypeScript and React for front end, the thing that really I'm starting to question more and more, especially with the number of the investment in front ends and the complexity that goes with that, the amount of effort it takes to develop front ends these days. I find just looking at React and the way you have to develop it just to get Gene Kim in one fireside chat, he was talking about he would love to have the ability just to put a button on a page easily. And for me, React is quite challenging to, one, to start out, and two, to continuous developing in that space. And even writing tests in that space becomes quite challenging. So I'm not UI is not my, I mean, I love the beauty of it, but to develop in that space, for me, I find it quite frustrating. And I think one of the factors is because it's so complicated.
It's very complex, very complex. And I've seen too that with low levels of skill, you can generally put something together, but it actually takes quite a decent amount of skill to put something together that is performant,
Yeah.
and it doesn't throw errors in weird edge cases, and it's different state management handling, all these kind of problems. It actually takes quite a decent amount of skill to get a good performant front end in those kind of technologies.
Oh, absolutely.
It's hard.
But you need to,
It's hard.
I think you need to write some tests for the front end.
Write tests.
Yeah.
Maybe I got to go back and say, hey, we should write tests on our front end. Come on. What should I tell them? What should I tell my engineers, Fred?
Tell your engineers.
I'll say, Fred said, don't make me bring Fred over here. Don't make me call Fred.
Say we probably can't put it on the same umbrella, because I think there's the same as when you're in a group situation and you are intimidated. So if you have engineers coming in and says, look, I just don't know how to write tests. I picked up some engineering along the way, been in organizations where I had a bit of exposure, and it's been a mixed match. I don't know how to write any good quality test. Then it'd be good to take that person and go, come on, let's go and write some tests.
Well, that is actually a very good topic, because a segue to one of our topics, because I actually hire people who, write tests as a expected way of working, generally speaking. So all of my engineers are quite capable of writing tests, no problems. I have had conversations in the past, though, with other engineering leaders, and when I suggested to them that, let's say you have a code exercise, a code review process, a bit of a coding exercise as part of the interview process for those take-home tests, I raised with them, it's reasonable to auto fail candidates if they don't provide tests with their code. And that engineering leader I was talking to I was putting forward this position, and that engineering leader was like, no way, can't be done. Now, I mean, it was a different city of the world, so all talent markets are different. You certainly have differences across the world in different cities and developer communities. But what do you think about how hard should you be if you're recruiting somebody, or if you're interviewing somebody? Are tests like a non-negotiable for you?
I mean, I've been in situations where especially if it's doing a coding exercise in the interview itself. Some candidates would go away and they'll start doing something beforehand, then they bring it in. And I always look at, for me, it's the thought process that really becomes important. So can you take me through, how did you start? What were you thinking? Because then you can verify it as well. So you can get an indication of because there's been scenarios where the rationale behind it was that I wanted to demonstrate the implementation, the solution part, without really focusing on test. But there's also been scenarios where really, you're very serious about testing. Yeah. So I wouldn't go as far as this throwing it. If the expectation is to deliver something based on the brief of this is going to production, I want you to write an API based on X, then I would expect test. But if it is a scenario where it's a very generic brief and it can be misinterpreted, and in that session, then I would like to be in a session where we can actually either understand if it's something that is important, to the engineer, especially if it's good code. And if you really look at the code and it's really good, to be in a position to say, well, let's write some tests. And you can sense if the person is somebody that's comfortable writing tests. But I'm not a no go if there's no test. But again, it also depends on the number. So being if you're going to get a large percentage of applicants coming through, then based on the ranking of that, the ones who's written test will be right at the top.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's kind of I hear you. I think I've had times as a hiring manager where I have had like a non-negotiable line, but then other times where I've been more flexible. I know one engineer that I hired didn't write tests for his coding exercise, but instead went and developed this cool little ASCII UI thing for it. I was like, he got the interview because of his little UI thing. So he got to the next round because it was cool. It was really good. I was like, man, this is awesome. This little little ASCII UI thing. It was quite little trendy thing. It was cool. So and he ended up being a great hire. So I guess having that non-negotiable stance, sometimes you can miss great engineers.
But where we are in today's day and age, with what is the resources available, conferences, free conference material non-stop, I think it becomes harder and harder to look at and code or somebody's investment in preparation for an interview and to discard that if there's no test. I mean, then where have you been? Yeah. How much are you actually investing in your own skill and career and learning stuff? Because it's not a case that nothing's available. It's not a scenario these days where you can go, I didn't know.
Mm.
Because you just have to Google what are best practices for implementing, and testing would be one of them. And there's beautiful lessons and talks about testing strategies, taking you through how to write tests. So I think these days it's time's run out. No more excuses.
Yeah. I don't know if you would approve of this process, but you can tell me, Fred, what you think. But one of the cheeky ways that I sort of have a level of I do have an expectation of testing in my current role as CTO, right? And I expect that engineers will write some level of tests. I don't generally, though, give them much there's not much formality about what that means. It is very contextual and it's kind of up to the developer. I do give some examples though. Like I will say, if you're working on something quite experimental, like a feature that's very experimental, you may not be as rigorous in your testing. It could be thrown away, it could be redone in a couple of months. Who knows? If, on the other hand, though, it's something that contains some kind of business logic, calculation, that kind of thing, it's probably like a no-brainer to go and write tests for that and make sure it's accurate. One thing that I've found interesting is that when the project was first started, I built a continuous delivery pipeline. Everything was automated all the way to production. And when an engineer committed code, it actually deployed to staging and production at the same time. And a lot of people kind of freak out about that sometimes when I explain that to them. They're like, well, how does that work? But no, there's like the one single build will get built and then pushes to both concurrently. And I guess historically, teams would go to staging, pre-production, whatever, like test it, Mr. Manual, test it all, and then promote it to production. I'm like, nah, straight to prod. But what that's meant is when some engineers question that, my response to them was, well, it's probably a question of confidence, right? Because this is going to prod. So I think what has happened over time is that there are probably more tests than there would have otherwise been. I mean, I don't have a time machine or to take another timeline and find out what would have happened if we didn't do this. But I suspect that there's more testing than there would have been because this level of confidence has to be at a certain level, because that if you commit this, it's going to production. What do you think of that? Do you think that's something that teams could adopt as a practice?
I think so. I I mean, if we're talking about dark releases as a mechanism to help with that, I think it's even synthetic testing, to be aware of something breaking before your customer knows about it. So I think you be more focused because there's no second parachute. Once you pull the trigger, that's it. And it's a change of a mindset as well. As soon as you talk about trunk-based development, you're saying, hey, you're chucking something in main and run it through a pipeline and it's going to production. People get seriously scared and they'll chuck a few like, oh, well, but how do I know it's working? And oh, what about this? And,
Yep.
but I think there's some real value in that.
Well, we've actually gone.
In sport is that old saying about the way you train is the way you will be playing on the day. And I think that's, you could actually bring that into engineering. Whereas we know that if I push something to UAT or a staging environment and I still have a day or two to go and do some smoke testing and making sure, and then to production. Yeah, that's, don't really have to worry too much.
Well, this might freak you out, Fred. I don't know, but we've actually gone one step further. You're holding onto your seat.
Safe environment.
We've actually gone one step further. We've shut down our staging environment. So now, when you commit, the only thing between you and production is the pipeline.
No staging?
No staging, mate.
You don't know staging?
We switched it off. Switched off staging.
Yeah. What do you have no staging?
It's still there as a bit of a safety blanket, but it has an automated job that shuts it down every night. But I don't think I'd have to go back and check because in the pipeline it has all the history of if someone spun it up. I'd have to go back and check the last time someone spun it up. I suspect it was like 2 months ago, probably more, maybe 3 months ago, that someone's actually spun up staging. So now we're totally into production, just straight to prod.
But it's exciting.
It is exciting. Hey, you're living at that point.
To be in a position that you can talk about your development and delivery processes where you are pushing the envelope, you are learning techniques and skills that's transferable, and you participating in a live use case of that. I mean, that's the ultimate. Whether you want to work in a legacy where you have somebody that you phone, we're going to be deploying in a month's time. So please be available at 2 a.m. on a Saturday.
Schedule.
You're like, all right, we're ready. You can push the button. We're going to push the button. Yeah.
Yep. Everyone's watching to make sure it's working.
But all of this only really work if it's a combination of multiple techniques and implementations. If you don't have all of that in place, then it becomes a risky environment.
Yeah. We use feature flags quite. We don't use it as heavily as we probably could, but we certainly, particularly for high risk areas, we had a feature recently that when it came through the design and product area, I saw the feature. The first time I saw the feature, I was like, "Ooh, ooh, that's going to be a bit dicey on the performance side." And just thinking about the amount of database queries that would have had to have run to support that UI, I thought that that's really effectively, it was something like for one search on the system, you're basically probably multiplying the database load by 10, maybe. That was my guesstimate when it was in early stages. And so, interesting though, it was good, I guess, that it was flagged quite early as a risk area, because then what happened was when the team started work on it, it was quite heavily feature flagged. And so, and it actually did cause problems when the feature flag was switched on, even for one user. So we put on for one user, and that user was actually able to crash the server.
Oh, wow.
Now, it was actually a bug, not quite the initial problem that I was flagging up earlier. It was actually a different problem, but really good, I guess, that we had it feature flagged, of course, because once we worked out, as we started to test it, switch it on for one person, which is internal, an internal user, they would use it and it would crash. I was like, cool. So we could, pretty quickly figure that out and make sure our flags were all in line. But I guess it's a habit now that the team are in that, you start a feature and it's the feature flag's created. All of the change work and things like that are put behind that flag. So what we used to do was we would deploy to staging and production at the same time, but we would have different flags on each environment. So you would get the same build, but it would look different. Effectively, what we've done though, now we've just replicated the same thing, but we're only using one environment. So when a feature flag is created, it's usually switched on for internal users, but for outside customers, it's off. And so we effectively still use the same mechanism, but we just do it within prod now. And it seems to work pretty well. The other day, we did create some changes that weren't behind a feature flag, and then the product team were like, how come this thing's half broken? I was like, that's right. We need to make sure we flag that.
Love a feature flag.
Feature flags, that's it. No, that's saved our bacon when we had that new crazy feature coming down the pipeline. That was a good move. Well, I think we've covered the topic, Fred.
We've tested it.
We've tested.
The coverage is good.
The coverage is good.
We went dark.
No flaky tests.
No flaky test.
I guess we'll have to measure our bugs to see if we really have tested appropriately.
Do we have the metrics?
Maybe we can see when we put this video up. We can see the comments. That'll be our metric.
Yeah, be interesting to hear the thoughts, opinions of those out there in the wild.
Yeah.
Their horror stories.
Yeah.
The things they appreciate about testing. The mentors and the ambassadors in their lives, the ones that help them along the way to learn new ways of thinking. The decisions around the testing pyramid and all the goodies that goes with it.
Yep. Definitely. No, it's been a good chat, mate. It's a very good topic.
Thank you, Dan. It's been good.
Fun.
It's been awesome. It's been awesome. Engineers of awesome.
Engineering of awesome. That's it. All good, mate. Well, we will chat again soon.
We will sure do.